So welcome everyone. Thank you for attending Stamp Talks. I'm looking forward to hearing Chris's speak today. And Chris, thank you for stepping up and volunteering to give a talk. These things wouldn't be possible if it wasn't for people like you helping out. And also I want to thank Sparks Auctions. They're our sponsor. In fact, if you go over to their website at sparks-auctions.com. They have an auction in a few weeks, November 28th, I think it is, if I remember correct, 27th, 28th. So you can go there and check it out, or you can go to the Stamp Auction Network and bid there, or check it out at least. They got a lot of good stuff coming up. So today's speaker, like I said, is Chris, and I will turn it over to you, Chris. We look forward to hearing from you.
Okay, well, thank you, Joe. And now we have, talking of Halloween, now we get the super scary bit. Share screen.
Auction for November 22nd to 24th. Perfect. Thank you for posting that in.
And I need to get that. Slideshow. Success. Okay. So, welcome everyone. The topic, as you will have read, is paying for airmail, Canadian Airmail Stamps and Protocols 1928. And part of this is going to be about the cover on the right, which has 6 different airmail stamps, all issued over a 12-year period. But when I've seen the list of participants in the royal panels before, there's some names I know well and other names which I don't recognize. And the aim of the panels and the talks was to sort of give an introduction to new collectors. So I'm going to begin with some very general comments about airmail, and we'll then move on to the detailed information. And so a good point to begin is with my oldest cover from 1928. And the question is, how did you get airmail for 1 cent? And one needs to look at the cover. It's from Pelee Island, which some people will know very well as the almost southernmost point of Canada. And on this map, I hope you're not getting the taskbar, which is blocking things. That looks like lovely summer map, blue water, produced by the Ontario Tourist Board. However, in winter, that is a photograph taken by Chris Hadfield from the space station. So there is the tip of Point Pelee that some of you will know is a terrific spot for bird watching. There is Pelee Island. Leamington would be up about here. And there was terrific problems in getting mail or anything over to Pelee Island during the winter because the ice would keep breaking up. It would swirl around the island. It was not stable enough for people to drive over. And yet it could pack up and clump together and be really tricky for the ferry. So the solution in 1927 is that the Canada Post introduced an airmail service, flying the mail from Leamington to Pelee Island. And this was known as an air stage service, and the post office made no extra charge for the airmail. So on the left here, you have a first flight cover from the very first flight, which is the one shown in the photograph, dated December 14th, 1927. That is at the regular letter rate, 2 cents. The cover above is a circular from the dealer, A.C. Rossler, which was a printed card. And so that could go at the printed postage rate of 1 cent. So for 1 cent, it was flown from Pelee Island to Leamington, and then it would have continued by surface routes. And this was an innovation by the post office. At this time, January 1928, they had 5 of these routes. The one near Lac de Bonnet in Manitoba to gold mines. Similarly, Red Lake going up to gold mines. There's Pelee Island, one along the north shore of the St. Lawrence, where the ice again would tend to blow in and stop boats getting in. And similarly, one to the Magdalen Islands. So that was the winter services, all with no charge for the airmail. And the dotted line is a summer service, which they had introduced the year before. Steamships coming over from Britain into Quebec or Montreal, they would come up the St. Lawrence River, and in Rimouski, they would stop and they would take aboard a pilot for the river. And there's the pilot boat going out to one of the steamers. And in 1927, they tried the experiment of, they would transfer the pilot and then they would transfer some of the mail onto the pilot boat, which would bring it into Rimouski, and it was flown to Montreal. And when things worked well, you would get a 1 or 2 day saving in terms of the time the mail took from Europe. And in the summer of 1928, on the May 6th, they reintroduced that service. And again, at no extra charge. And it was a twice-a-week service at that time. And it not only went from Rimouski up to Montreal, but it then connected in Montreal to Ottawa and to Toronto, and planes would also go in the reverse direction. And so this was reckoned to be pretty cool. In Montreal, you could drop mail off by 9:30 in the morning. It would arrive in Toronto, I'll try and cover up that spelling mistake, by 5 p.m. And so you could get same day messages between Montreal and Toronto. Now, there was also a couple of other things. Joe, can I just tell you, I'm getting the black bar. Does everybody else see that as well?
No, everything looks really good on my screen.
So you're just seeing my complete screen?
Yes.
Great, I'm reassured. Okay, so the other, in terms of paying for airmail, there was a couple of other things going on at this time. One was the semi-official airmail services. These were the bush plane operations flying into gold mining and exploration camps. And to make more money, they were allowed to charge to carry the mail. They were supposed to put their stamps on the back of the envelope so they didn't get confused with regular postage. But Patton and Smith are both philatelists, and they put their covers, they had covers with the stamps on the front. And the other possibility for speeding up mail was the American airmail services, which the map shows were getting established. There was a transcontinental route from New York right over to San Francisco. Chicago was the hub. You could go up to Minneapolis, and you could also go down as far as the Texas border. If you were a Canadian and you wanted to use the American airmail routes, you were allowed to, but you had to pay the American airmail fee in addition to the regular Canadian postage, and you had to pay it in American stamps. So on this cover, from Winnipeg to New York, says via airmail from Minneapolis. So it would have taken the train from Winnipeg to Minneapolis and then been flown to New York. The rate there was 10 cents per half ounce. So it's a 2 cents franking for the surface mail up to 1 ounce, 10 cents registration, 20 cents for the airmail. And so that's the background. And then things should have got simpler because there was a reciprocal airmail agreement between Canada and the US, and it should have been great. They agreed that they would use the same airmail rate of 5 cents for the first ounce. This would cover all the airmail services in either country, and each country would accept the airmail stamps produced by the other country. And in the States, that led to a huge increase in the amount of people using airmail. On July the 28th, and this was announced, August the 1st, here's our first flight cover with the new 5 cent American airmail stamp from August the 1st. But if you look for covers for the first day of the new rate in Canada, you get this. It says 5 cents for the first ounce for the American rate, but it is franked at 2 cents Canadian surface rate, and they paid the American postage, but with the 5 cent stamp, not the old 10 cents. And the special delivery stamp was put on to a nice philatelic cover. Well, was this a philatelic cover? No, because 4 days later, you have commercial mail, still franked, surface rate, plus American airmail. And it turned out that although they had negotiated the reciprocal airmail agreement, the Canadian Post Office did not issue any bulletins about it, nor did they immediately advertise this agreement to Canadian postmasters. And that was the conclusion of Walter Plomish. He and George Afghan, they wrote a terrific book, Airmails of Canada, 1925 to 39. A quick aside, that is probably the most easily available best book for people who want more information about Canadian airmail, and you can still buy it through BNAT's publications. But, it was written in 2000. Walter Plomish was doing his research in 1980s, 1990s. And I thought, okay, let's check this. We have the internet, we have newspaper archives. This is crazy. Surely the Canadian Post Office did something to publicize this. And so I sort of worked through the best of the internet with best of my ability and found nothing. And so I contacted Kathy Hartley, who was the librarian at the Vincent Green Foundation at the time, and a terrific researcher. And she took on the challenge. And the first announcement that she could find was August the 6th. And nobody knows why it took them so long. But this 5 cents rate, it only applied to airmail using the US airmail routes. the Canadian Post Office continued flying mail at no extra charge over the surface routes, like the one along the St. Lawrence. And then, philatelically, there was a game changer. The Canadian National Exhibition was opening in August. This is the beginning of a long, narrow advert for it, but you'll see that right at the top, the big feature for the 50th anniversary, ahead of all the bands and the mass chorus and the sideway shows, is the first international aircraft show. And as part of the events, along with the air battles, thrilling formations by 30 planes in one flight, were going to be airmail flights. Because this was the 1920s, aviation was a big deal. Philately was a big deal. The combination was terrific. The post office responded by saying it would produce special souvenir covers. There were going to be flights from Montreal, Ottawa, and Kingston to Toronto, and another one coming from the west, from Windsor. There would be covers produced, and you could get a souvenir cachet on your cover, but you had to pay at the airmail rate, 5 cents for the first ounce. The covers were extremely popular. For the flights into Toronto, 32,000 covers were flown. 5 days later, on the return flights, 27,000 covers were flown. And there were special cachets from the different cities to Toronto and from Toronto, and also ones like this one between Kingston and Montreal, you know, where you could get intermediate covers going. And then things went back to the status quo, went back to carrying mail between Toronto and Montreal at the regular rate. This is September 24th, 2 cents. But the post office was planning. It's a daily service. And it was finally announced September 27th, the daily service between Montreal and Toronto was about to begin on October the 1st, but now you had to pay the airmail fee. And their argument at the post office was that this was an optional, faster service. You now had the choices between regular mail at the surface rate by train, or for the premium price of 5 cents per ounce, you could fly your mail and it would be quicker. And in preparation for that, they produced, Canada's first airmail stamp. And the lovely thing about doing Zoom talks like this is that I can enlarge the stamp so everybody can see it. The disadvantage is that I'm talking to the computer screen and we don't get the chance for audience comments. And at this point, if this was a live presentation, I would be saying, why would a lovely stamp like this produce a public outcry and furor? And so Joe is the stand-in for the complete audience. And this is also a chance to just slip in a big thank you to Joe, who is running all of these Zoom meetings. He runs the panels. He's doing a terrific job. and I am not going to embarrass you by asking challenging questions. So I gave Joe a couple of clues beforehand. So Joe, thank you for your computer work. And
Thanks.
why do you think this stamp was so controversial?
Are those two women?
Yes.
And there was something about only men at the time.
That's right. According to the Bible,
Yes.
the angels are the sons of God. So they should have been male. And these figures were most definitely female. And the other controversy is, in order to get a nice design, they each only have one wing. They
yes.
So that was the designer's liberty. Okay, now these stamps actually get a delightful challenge if one's interested in them. One of the questions is, if you want a first day cover, which date do you choose? Because they were issued on September the 21st, but the requirement in the post office guide was that they could only be used on airmail. And the only way you could get a properly used cover on the September the 21st was if you mailed it to the States. So this is a September 21st cover. The first flights, airmail carrying flights in Canada, were the next day, and you will find these covers, which are on the September 22nd. First use in Canada, but they are over-franked. And the stamp was not necessary. On October the 1st, you can get properly used covers, both for Montreal, Toronto, which was now being charged at the 5 cents rate, and also from Montreal to Albany. But this leads to another question, which is October the 1st, the first flight covers say Montreal to Albany, but the first flight covers come in north, say New York to Montreal. And so as an aside, what happened is that the route was actually run in 2 stages. There was a flight from New York up to Albany, and that aircraft, having dropped off the mail, would turn around and go back to New York. And a second aircraft would take the mail from Albany north to Montreal, gets there at 11:15, and in the afternoon, it would fly from Albany back from Montreal to Albany. And in Albany, the mail was put on the train. So it would arrive in New York several hours before mail, which had been would normally arrive, and it could make all sorts of connections from New York. It seems an odd situation, but from the airline's point of view, you would normally find a lot more people want to fly from Albany into New York in the morning, because they could have breakfast in Albany, fly into New York, do an afternoon's business, take the train back when they were ready to leave. So the airline would have been okay with the one-way route, and the Canadian Post Office liked the fact that it was cheaper, but it still produced an accelerated service. The next big change in Canadian airmail was the experimental Prairie airmail service. And this had one route, Winnipeg, Regina, Calgary, and there's a spur, Regina, Saskatoon, Edmonton. And so you would essentially get 3 aircraft converge on Regina. They would transfer the mail and then they would fly back. And if you remember, the Canadian Post Office had made a lot of money from souvenir cachets on the Canadian National Exhibition flights. And they did the same again. For the experimental Prairie airmail service, they not only had a different cachet for each leg of the flight, they also changed the colors. So you had a different color for each week. But although they had lots of cachets, they did not publicize the service well. And you had confusion over the rates. On the left, we have a properly franked cover at 5 cents. On the right, a cover franked 7 cents. And the assumption is that the person thought that it was still the same process as back in July, and you had to pay the airmail fee in addition to the surface rate. The other confusion is that the post office did not publish any rates to overseas countries. And so people had to figure it out for themselves. And some people figured, well, the airmail rate is 3 cents over regular rate, so they would send a letter to Britain for 6 cents, being the 3 cent surface rate to Britain plus 3 cents for the airmail fee. This person, though, thought that the airmail fee, the regular 5 cent stamp, would cover airmail on a cover going to Britain as well. He had a different, or the post office had a different opinion. They have taxed it as 30 cents postage due. Now is actually 30 centimes. The rate was 5 centimes per cent. So that is equivalent to a 6 cent surcharge based on 3 cents deficiency. So this post office thought the cover should have been franked at 8 cents. This post office let it go through at 6 cents. And something to remember about these rates, though, is that the air stage services continued. So you only needed to pay the airmail fee if you wanted the optional faster airmail service, or on the air stage services, the post office was opening a lot of them. They were producing first flight cachets for each new service, which were very popular. But in order to get the first flight cachet, you had to pay your mail at the airmail rate. And so this could have been a business cover to the factor of the Hudson's Bay Company in Arctic Red River in the Northwest Territories. But to get the souvenir cachet, they had to frank it at the 5 cents rate. And this leads to one of my favorite covers. It is very old and worn and tatty because it flew all the way, well, it traveled all the way from a Klavik way up on the Arctic Ocean to Tanganyika in British East Africa, and all for 5 cents. Because by this time they had decided that the 5 cent rate applied to airmail in Canada to the United States or to the British Empire. things got simpler. Well, things got clearer, if not simpler, on March the 1st, 1930, when the post office actually published a full schedule of airmail rates. And so there was two types. There's airmail rates, postage for airmail service in Canada and the United States. And after that, it went by surface routes. If you wanted airmail service outside of Canada and the United States, they listed the fees by country. And I've just shown the top of the list so you see how it is laid out, because I don't expect anybody to be able to read the full list. Every country broken down. So under this new regime, it is now published that another cover from Aklavik to Tanganyika, the charge would now be 7 cents if it wanted airmail services available in Canada. Then it goes by surface across the Atlantic and surface routes down to Tanganyika. But at this time, they were beginning to get Imperial Airways airmail routes going from Britain down to Africa. And if it wanted to have air transport, it would have to be paid at 15 cents. Fortunately, I think one of the, having knocked the post office for its poor communication, I think it made a terrific decision. The following year, February the 2nd, 1931, it brought in new rate structures. Now countries were grouped. You no longer had to look for every individual country. The rates were grouped. The cover to Tanganyika would now be in group 3, Africa, 15 cents per half ounce. And whilst this was going on, Canada had, in between that period, Canada had issued a second airmail stamp. It is known as C2 in the Scott catalogue. It had a new stamp because they changed the printer of the Canadian stamps. It came out in December of 1930, and the stamp, it was issued before there was the big interest in first day covers. And the result was that it is very difficult to get a first day cover of this stamp. And according to the FDC specialist, no cached first day covers of the stamp are known to exist. But in fact, it is very rarely found on mail. Most mail was still franked with the old C1 stamp, like this one, which is an anomaly because it's franked 5 cents, charge postage due. And what had happened is that in June 1931, the post office had announced a new service between Vancouver and Victoria, and it was going to produce first flight covers. Instructions were frank 5 cents sent to the postmaster. But in between issuing the first flight cover announcement and the first flight, the airmail rate had been increased to 6 cents for the first ounce. And as a result, the post office charged postage due when the first flight covers were flown. Now, there is a controversy some people point out that the announcement for the increase was not done through a change to the post office regulations. It was done during the budget, and it was done by reintroducing the war tax that had applied during the First World War and for several years afterwards. And so the budget just reintroduced the tax. It would not actually pass it through the post office legislation. And the result is that some people say it wasn't a 6-cent rate, it was 5 cents plus 1 cent tax. And I'm raising that in case anybody was about to ask it in the Q&A later on. But as far as I'm concerned, the post office just referred to the new rate of 6 cents. And if that's what the post office called it, that's what I'm going to call it. Now, this was July the 1st, 1931. There were, just like nowadays, every now and again, the airmail rates changed. Many changes between 1931 and 1939, but none of them affected the airmail rate within Canada. So I am going to pass over all of the airmail changes and focus now on the stamps. C3 is the next one, issued on February the 22nd, 1932. And so 8 months after the rate increase, and they overprinted the old C1. And at this point, first aid cover collecting had taken off, and it is quite easy to find first aid covers for C3. Now, the postage rate had gone up as part of the Depression. Sort of responses. Another response at this time was that they curtailed and cancelled all the fast optional airmail routes. Prime Minister Bennett made the comment, with 300,000 of the population receiving some form of relief, you know, there's no gratification in seeing an aeroplane passing day by day, when the unfortunate owner of the soil could hardly see the airplane because his own crop had gone up in dust. So all the airmail, these are the fast airmail services, the optional ones were cancelled. The air stage services, where mail was being flown to remote places at surface rates, they all continued. The next stamp, C4, was in connection with another response to the Depression, this one being the Imperial Economic Conference being held in Ottawa in July 1932. The aim was to increase trade within the empire by raising tariffs against everything outside the empire. And this was the big hope for getting out of the Depression. And the comment that Sunday, July the 17th, was declared a national day of prayer for the success of the negotiations. Unfortunately, that did not work. The Depression went on for many more years. As part of the conference, the post office came up with a variation on the Rimouski St. Lawrence River airmail service to impress people at the conference to get mail from London to Ottawa as quickly as possible. The mail was flown from London to Cherbourg, where the steamer, the Empress of Britain, stopped en route. And then when it passed Red Bay, the mail was transferred to a boat, taken to the Brador Bay Post Office, and flown to Ottawa. And that produced a terrific saving of several days in the passage of mail. But it was also a very complicated arrangement. And although it was summer, they had a lot of problems with fog in the St. Lawrence River. And as a result, although it worked, it was not repeated. Okay, another, the joy of Zoom, the biggest possible enlargement of this stamp, because Daedalus, the famous Greek hero, is in flight, but the background is not Greece. It is a view across the Strait of Georgia near Victoria. Now we have a couple of people on the in the audience who are from British Columbia, and I would be glad to hear your comments as to whether or not that view looks like a view across the Strait of Georgia near Victoria later on, or whether, is this clearly distinctive, or did they just sort of take it as a nice mountain range? Now, here's a first day cover for the C5. It went from Ottawa to Calgary. It's franked with the 6-cent airmail stamp, but there were no airmail services between Ottawa and Calgary. This is a map of the fast North American airmail routes at that time in 1935. There are none in Canada. There is one from Vancouver down to Seattle, Winnipeg, Pembina down to Chicago, and Montreal, Albany, New York. So if you wanted to get a letter from Montreal to Vancouver, the fastest way was flying it down to New York, across the USA, and back up. And this began to be a big concern, especially in 1936. This is the first flight of the Empire Flying Boat, which was Britain's venture to produce transatlantic airmail service. Aviation was still a big deal, lots of talk about transatlantic airmail, but what would happen once the mail reached Canada? They wanted the flights into Montreal, but then it would be dependent on American airmail routes. And Canada had had a pretty rough experience negotiating with the American Post Office and the airlines with regard to sort of service. For example, from Winnipeg down to Minneapolis, the post office wanted the flights to leave Winnipeg as late as possible to feed mail into the American system. But the airline wanted them to fly during daylight. So they wanted a much earlier departure. And going north, the post office wanted a delivery to match the railway schedules for railway post offices leaving Winnipeg. The airlines was more interested in the overall schedule going from Minneapolis across to the West Coast. They wanted to tie it in with their schedules, the passenger schedules and they weren't particularly concerned about what the Canadian Post Office wanted. Solution to this was that they formed Trans-Canada Airlines in 1937 with a mandate to develop a cross-Canada airmail service. And this was one of a number of changes taking place at this time. Beginning to get out of the Depression, there was a lot of new air stage services had been opened, still carrying regular mail for 2 cents, but 3 cents now, but it needed the airmail stamp to get the first flight cachet. There were new fast airmail services. This was one, they now went from Montreal to Burlington, so that it would connect with the airmail route to Boston. March 1938, TCA began carrying mail on its development flights. And in fact, by the summer of 1938, that was the overall route map of proposed and operating airmail services. There's a proposed Trans-Canada one. They did have one flying north up to Yellowknife, which is too small for, there we go. And they had a lot of the air stage services. And the Canadian Post Office decided it would like a stamp to convey the idea that airmail was now widely available across the country. And that is the stamp that was produced. C6, issued on June 15th, 1938. And there is was an absolutely terrific article by Jim Kramer, who was at one time the curator of the National Postal Museum, about the design of that stamp, which I think is really cool. They started with this photograph of the SS distributor on the Mackenzie River. The designer, Herman Schwartz, he isolated the ship and the mountain range, but he also elongated them to give them more impact. Then they added waterfront activities at a Clavic from a second photograph. And then they added the aircraft. And the aircraft was a Fairchild Sukani, which was absolutely top of the line bush plane at the time. It was being developed. They thought it would be great. And it turned out that it wasn't. It had a lot of development problems. And the aircraft has been put in the stamp in a sort of an angle for drama and make a good image. The general feeling is that it is a bit too dramatic, and that if the aircraft had ever ended up at that angle, it would have crashed. But it's a nice stamp. A couple more important dates. March 1st, 1939 was the inauguration of the Trans-Canada Airmail Service. You could now get overnight flying between Montreal and Winnipeg. A letter mailed at Vancouver at 5:30 in the evening would reach Montreal 11:50 the next day. A letter mailed in Montreal at 8 p.m. would reach Vancouver at 11:05 a.m. And at this time, there were all sorts of deliveries in Montreal and special delivery. So it would in fact be possible for somebody to have sent a letter from Vancouver, mailed a letter on Monday evening in Vancouver. It arrives in Montreal on Tuesday. A reply could be sent back the same day, and they would get that reply in Vancouver by midday on Wednesday. That was a big deal at the time. Philately and aviation still very important. This is one of 40 different first flight caches the post office produced. Over 80,000 first flight covers were carried. And then finally, we get back to the cover, which started the talk with the complete set of 6 airmail stamps. A result is that it is franked at 34 cents, not 30 cents. The 4-cent franking was quite common, a little bit over franking amongst philatelists. The covers, again, super popular, 121,000 mailed from New York, 34,772 from Shediac. And that has brought us full circle to the cover on the first screen. So over to you, Joe.
Thank you. That was great. Do we have any questions that people want to throw into the Q&A, and we can get Chris to answer them? I guess you covered everything pretty thoroughly.
Q&A, that's it.
All right, well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to end the session, and I'll promote everyone up to talk and social time.